Good morning, everyone. Can someone give a thumbs up if they can see the slideshow? That is okay, great. Thank you. Have a few more people waiting. We're letting them in. Glad to see so many people here. I'll begin in just a minute or so. Okay, and for those of you who've been patient as we've begun the show, thank you very much. Welcome to our Constitution Day program this morning, September 17th, 2020. We are presenting the Electoral College, Founder's Miracle and Pollsters Nightmare. My name is Michaela Ayers. I'm Director of Butler Community College Libraries and Archives. Each institution that is an educational institution receiving federal funds is required to hold an educational program about the U.S. Constitution for its students. So we're happy to do so this year. Although I hope you also managed to get some of SGA's cupcakes that are available on the two campus student unions as well. As director of the library, I have done a scholarly program every year for a number of years that I've been here. And I want to mention that our librarians are available to help you right now with registering for an absentee ballot or any other voting information you may need at either of the two Butler Community College libraries in El Dorado and Andover. Our hours are 8 to 7, Monday through Thursday, and 8 to 5, Friday. Let me just mention another couple of things. I will be monitoring the chat for questions for our time at the end. And this program is being recorded for Butler's YouTube channel. Now, I'd like to turn it over to our first panelist, Bill Young, Butler's Chief Information Officer and the Mayor of El Dorado. Let's see if I can turn this. Bill, thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. This federal holiday commemorates the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th, 1787. The Constitution defines the structure of our federal government, and it remains to this day, in my opinion, the most remarkable political charter in history. Hi, I'm Bill Young, the Vice President of Digital Transformation and Chief Information Officer for Butler Community College. Almost a year ago, I was fortunate enough to be elected by the citizens to serve as the Mayor of El Dorado, Kansas. Throughout my life, I've been elected to multiple local municipal government positions as a way to serve my community and to serve my fellow citizens. As we all know, a lot has changed since 1787. The Constitution, as it was originally written, left a lot of people out. And the long fight for equality continues to this day, but one thing has not changed: the need for a government that will secure our individual rights and do so without abusing its powers. Ultimately, the Constitution was not enacted for the politicians, the pollsters, or the pundits. The Constitution was enacted by the people for the benefit of the people, which means it's up to the people, it's up to all of us to preserve, protect, and defend it. As this is an election year, we all felt it appropriate to talk a little bit about the election process. As we know, the President of the United States is elected through the system of an electoral college. This system empowers states, especially smaller ones, because it incentivizes presidential candidates to appeal to places that may be far away from population centers. For example, farmers in Kansas may have a very different concerns than bankers in New York. So a more federalist system of electing presidents takes that into account. Dr. Isam Mohammed, the Associate Vice President of Research and Institutional Effectiveness here at Butler Community College, is here today to tell us about the Electoral College and all of the nuances surrounding the election process. And Brian E. Smith, Butler's research specialist, will hopefully help us understand a little better the polling process and how polls work. As Michaela mentioned, we'll have time for some questions and conversations later in the presentation. So I guess right now, Dr. Mohammed, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate the kind words. And indeed, the Constitution is an incredibly remarkable document. If you think about it, it has essentially functioned largely unchanged over the last 233 years. That is quite a record compared to almost any other modern representative democracy. And when I look at it, one of the reasons of that resilience is that incredible balance that the framers were able to put together there in regards to several of their competing priorities. The Electoral College that we colloquially know it as is one of those examples. The framers, probably some of the smartest men ever assembled under the same roof. We got to see what they did, or at least we have seen from history what they've done. And that balancing act shows up in the Electoral College in this manner. The framers understood that there had to be a basic equality for the citizens, each individual being equal to another, even as we progress towards a more perfect union, as you pointed out. They also understood that this was supposed to be a federal republic, which meant along with equality of citizens, we were also supposed to have an equality, a fundamental equality of states. So that something as big as New York or California or Florida, in its essence, was the same constitutionally as smaller states like Delaware or Wyoming or middle-sized states like Kansas, which is why when my brother drives here from Illinois, his driver's license is as accepted in Kansas as somebody driving in from Delaware, which is a smaller state. That's the kind of the equality that we are talking about. So where does this Electoral College come in from? Actually, there's no word in the Constitution, no phrase called the Electoral College. That is what we use colloquially, drawing from Article 2, Section 1, Clauses 2 and 3, which require that presidents be elected in such a manner as states appoint a certain number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state is entitled in Congress. Great balancing act if you think about it, because as many of us know, in Congress, the states are represented in a couple of ways. In the House of Representatives, they're represented based on population. Bigger states get more representatives, smaller ones get less. At the same time, in the Senate, they're represented equally. Each of the states, whether it's Wyoming and Delaware on one hand or California at the other, get the same two representatives. So what does that end up looking like when it comes to electors who ultimately elect the president? And let's point this out fairly clearly that in the most fundamental and constitutional sense, the office of the president and vice president are perhaps the only elected offices in the United States at any level, which are not directly elected by citizens. They're elected by this special group of people we call electors. So what that ends up looking like is a state like California gets, as of today, it gets 55 electors. A state like Kansas gets 6. And there is a whole lot of ranges between those two. And somebody like Wyoming, for example, gets 3. Alaska gets 3. What you see there is a representation of both a combination, a mathematical combination of populations and states, the equality of citizens, but also the equality of states. So what that leads to is generally the smaller states, as Bill pointed out, have somewhat of a greater say, if you want, or at least their people do, when it comes to electing the president. Just dividing the number of the population of a state by the number of electors they get, this is kind of a rough a rough number that you come up with. California has 55 electors. And when I divide the population by that number, each elector in California represents about 745,000 people. In Kansas, we are a little luckier. We have 6 electors, and given our population, each elector roughly represents 485,000 people. Wyoming is perhaps the most powerful in that sense. 3 electors population divided by that gets us each elector representing 200,000 people in Wyoming. So when you go into the voting booth, and colloquially we think this year people will be voting for Joe Biden or Donald Trump or Dr. Jorgensen, the Libertarian candidate, and maybe a few others. But in a realistic sense, what we are doing is each state is participating in its own election. We actually have 51 different presidential elections simultaneously on that day. And when you go in to cast a ballot, what you are electing is a team of 6 people in Kansas who are either pledged to one candidate or the other, and then they get together and cast their ballots for the president. So far, so good. And most of the time, the popular vote lines up with the Electoral College vote. But there have been 5 instances where that hasn't happened. And one of those instances was in 2016, as many of us well know. That creates an incredible challenge sometimes for opinion pollsters. These days we're getting opinion polling almost every day. Because of the diversity of the states and the lack of straightforward proportionality of their populations to the electoral vote, opinion polling can be a challenge for presidential elections, as we have seen several times, especially in 2016. To kind of give us some context about it and what is being done and what has been done about it, we have an incredible expert on our own staff. Bryony Smith, you heard the mayor talk about her, that she is our expert in surveys and polling. How are pollsters and public going to have confidence in the plethora of opinion polls that come out almost every day? What are they doing to kind of make up for some of the challenges they have? To answer some of those questions, I'm going to turn it over to Bryony Smith to give us some context and illuminate some of these points. Bryony, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. The first thing I'm going to start out with is that I don't like to call polls right or wrong. Polls are opinions. They are what they are. The information gathered is what is gathered, but it can be more or less reliable or more or less reflective or accurate of what's actually going on. Polling is actually harder now than it has been in years past, and that kind of surprises people. We have a lot more technology. We have a lot more ways to reach people. People also have a lot more ways to avoid being reached. 30 years ago, people had a landline phone on the wall. They had no caller ID. The phone rang, you picked it up. Phone is the traditional method of political polling. So it was easier to get people. Now, many of us don't have a landline. We only have a cell phone. I don't know about you, but I get calls from numbers I don't recognize every day. I'm up on my bills. My car has a warranty. I don't answer any of these. So it's harder to reach people now. And it's more difficult sometimes to get that information, which does kind of influence some of the accuracy of the polls. Another challenge in political polling is that it relies on the respondent actually following through and going to vote. You can call and ask for people's opinion on things like which team are they rooting for in the Super Bowl. And you can pretty well guarantee that they're still going to like that team even if they don't watch the Super Bowl. But in political polling, you do have to kind of rely on them to go ahead and go to the voting box and cast their ballot. And as Isam has said, the popular vote and the electoral vote do not always match up, as we did see in 2016. There are a few different kinds of polls that we see quite often during especially a presidential election cycle, and we'll talk briefly about those. The first is what I call an opt-in poll. Often you see these on websites, sometimes websites that kind of maybe cater to the right or the left a little bit more. Fox News and MSNBC are a couple of examples I'm going to use. So there introduces some bias there because the people who visit those sites are more likely to be affiliated with that political party or that political bias. Again, to use the Super Bowl, If you happen to watch a Super Bowl and a TV and say the Denver or the Atlanta airport with people from all over the country, you would probably see a pretty good balance of people cheering when the Chiefs ran out on the field versus when the 49ers ran out on the field. If you watch a Super Bowl from around here in Wichita, if you were like us, I was the only one cheering for the 49ers when they ran out on the field. There was just a little bit more bias in who is actually there and who is voicing their opinion. The second kind of polling, which is what occurs through the election cycle, is a poll that uses random sampling. And the reliability of this type of polling is improved because polling companies or conductors use a number of different statistics to try to make sure that the people they're talking to accurately reflect the people who are voting. So they look at several demographic factors, including state of reference or state of residence, age, race, income level, education level, party affiliation, etc. The more closely the respondents match these demographics as compared to the total population, the more reliable these numbers tend to be. And the third kind of polling are exit polling. We see a lot of this being projected all through election day, and this was actually kind of how we first knew the outcome of the last election. These ask people who have actually voted, who they voted for after they've left the polls. So they do tend to be very accurate. Another thing we'll talk about before we go and look at some polls is the margin of error. You'll see this as a small plus or minus number at the bottom of the poll. And that means the number you look at in the poll could be that number higher or lower than the actual number that you see. That's kind of a calculation that we create to account for any possible error in sampling methodology. So we're going to go look at my screen and see a few polls on here. And first we're going to start, these are a few days old, but this is a Fox News poll that was recently released showing Biden and Harris with 51% and Trump Pence 46%. We can see this margin of error right here is 2.5 points. So for Biden and Harris, it could be anywhere from 48.5 to 53.5. Trump and Pence, 48.5 to 43.5. So there is actually some overlap there when you look at that margin of error. It looks a little closer than maybe it appears on the screen. We clicked through and looked at the methodology here. So this tells us how this data was gathered. If you just quickly browse through, you notice that the only factor that was used to stratify this survey was the number of voters in each state. There were 1,311 people who were talked to via landline and cell phone. The phone numbers were randomly selected as being from particular states. We can see one kind of problem here. Cell phone numbers are portable. There are a lot of people who have phone numbers that are not in the same state that they currently reside or that they're voting, because it's much easier to keep your number than to teach everyone a new one. So that's a possible error that's accounted for here. Also, this is a fairly small sample size of the 328 million people in the US. Fewer than 3 million live in Kansas. So they're talking to maybe 11 or 12 people from Kansas. That's not a very large sample of the population. So this is just something to look at. It doesn't, like I said, it doesn't mean a poll is right or wrong. It just maybe affects the reliability of that poll. Now we're going to go over to MSNBC and look at a short video. And I'm going to do what I don't like my husband to do at home, which is stop the video and talk in the middle of it. But here we go. Oops, let's go back to the beginning here. Okay, we're going to start out with this Fox News poll that we used. So that was the poll that we looked at Fox News. It's the same poll that's being used on Fox and MSNBC. Believe it or not, these agencies do share some information back and forth and do use some of the same information. So we're going to look at a couple of polls in Arizona that begin this video.
Bryony, you may want to start this again and this time choose share computer sound when you start your screen share.
Is the video not showing sound?
There's no sound, and it's a choice that you make when you first start to screen share as to whether or not you want to share computer sound. This happened to me at faculty day, and it was sort of a shock.
So here's the Arizona.
Meanwhile, the latest CBS News YouGov poll election.
The first Arizona poll, this was conducted by OHPI, OH Predictive Insights. And you can go basically just look and see if you're watching TV, you can tell which agency is conducting the poll. You can just kind of Google that and Google, OH Predictive Insights Arizona poll, and you can go and find their methodology. So they posted it here. It was a blended phone survey between live caller and IVR. IVR is where you kind of talk to that little computer automated voice. But it tells you that this poll weighted the sample demographics to accurately reflect gender, ethnicity, party affiliation, education level, and things of that nature. So this poll is maybe a little bit more reliable because it did take these things into account when creating these numbers. But you notice there's a plus or minus error percentage of 4 points. So what you see as a 10% lead could again be much less than that. And here's the next one.
50 and 15 days until the first debate. The latest Fox News national poll shows Joe Biden with a 5-point lead. Latest Fox News national poll shows Joe Biden with a 5-point lead over Donald Trump, 51 to 46%. And new battleground state polling out this morning is showing Joe Biden and President Trump statistically tied in several states. First to Arizona, where the latest OHPI poll of likely voters finds Biden ahead by 10, 52 to 42%. Meanwhile, the latest CBS News YouGov poll, this one of registered voters, has Biden.
And this is another one from Arizona that shows quite a different number. This only shows Biden ahead by 3 points, as opposed to last Arizona poll conducted around the same time, which showed that he was ahead by 10 points. A couple of things to look at here. The margin of error is about the same. They talked to about double the number of registered voters in this poll. The methodology for this one is actually pretty detailed when you go to look at it. It was also weighted according to gender, age, race, and education level based on voter registration lists. It was confirmed that these people were what they considered likely voters. It talks about how the margin of error was calculated. So we're not going to go through all of the polls in this video, but my goal here is just to get you to maybe be interested in looking at some of the methodologies for these polls. Again, it's not really difficult when you watch these videos. Just go look at the polling agency, go look at the state or area, Google it, and you can pretty easily find the background and the methodology for these polls. So a couple other sites that you can look at if you're interested in this. 538 is a site that doesn't do polling of its own for this particular election, but what it does is aggregate some of the national polls. So this takes all of these polls together, puts them together, which again gives you a little bit more data reliability. The more you have, the better, and gives you some different scenarios of where things might fall. Most people who have heard of polls have heard of Gallup agency. They're actually not doing any polling for the general election, but what they are doing is putting together several indicators that in historical context have influenced the presidential election. So there's several factors here that you can look at, like job satisfaction, economic confidence, and there's a whole page of election metrics that you can look at. Now, what we want to talk about, 2016 was inaccurate, or was it? As Isam pointed out, the polls in regards to the popular vote, those were accurate. Hillary Clinton received 3 million more votes from voters than did Donald Trump. However, he won the election because he received more electoral votes. Let's look at 538 from 2016. On November 8th, it gave Hillary Clinton still a 71.4% chance of winning, and it gave Donald Trump a 28.6% chance of winning. We know how this turned out. Donald Trump won pretty decisively in the Electoral College. So why did this happen? The American Association for Public Opinion Research actually dug into this, and they came up with a couple of really good points to look at and hopefully influence greater accuracy in polling this year. First of all, they noticed that there was a lot of late voter change between the time when some of the last polls were conducted and people actually went to cast their votes. A lot of people apparently changed their minds and switched from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump, or perhaps from undecided or a third-party candidate to Donald Trump. The biggest factor in looking at these stratifications is that the polls failed to capture data across different education levels. It's been discovered that people with higher education levels tend to have a higher participation rate in polling for whatever reason. And so people of a lower education level weren't always talked to, their opinions weren't always captured in this poll. So that's a major, hopefully, improvement that will be made in this year's polling cycle. And it was also found that a lot of the methodology used, especially in those state polls, was kind of on the cheaper side and maybe not so reliable. So if you're not as reliable within a state, then that really influences how you're able to predict those electoral votes. You can be very reliable in a nationwide poll, and those results were accurate. Hillary Clinton did receive more votes. But unless the state polls are equally reliable, it's hard to predict electoral votes, which is ultimately what determines the outcome of our presidential elections. So,
Ronnie, those are great resources, and I hope you'll post them in chat so some of us can cut and paste those, and particularly the last two, the 538. I've put them in there. They may or may not be accurate, so take a look at that and help us out. Thanks.
absolutely. Let's see if this is going to everyone or... Okay. There's the link to 538. And here's a link to a brief Pew Research article that kind of gives an overview of the report about the issues with polling in the last year, or in the last election cycle. And here's a link to the Gallup Election Center, where you can see some of these different metrics that are influencing the way that people vote. So ultimately, I would say watching polls is a great thing to do, but as we know, they don't always reflect reality. So there's never any excuse to not get out and vote. Request an absentee ballot, make sure that you're able to go to the polls that day if you don't want to vote by mail, but get out and vote. It really does matter.
Thank you. Do we have anything else from you, Doc Isam or Bill, as we go forward? And this is a chance for people to ask any questions they have. I just have one for Isam, I assume, and I'd like to take a chance to ask it now. I guess I don't understand how the Electoral College decided that they would only have 6 in Kansas and 3 in, couldn't they set it up so that there were Electoral College representatives who would represent the full population at a rate, say 1 per 200,000, no matter what state it was in?
That's a great question, Michaela, and partly they do that. The way it is set up, according to the Constitution, is each state gets a specific amount, which is made of the number of members that state has in the House of Representatives, which for us is 4. plus the members it has in the Senate, which is 2, so it becomes 4 plus 2 is equal to 6. So that is kind of set in the Constitution. And along with it, I mean, that goes along with something that Mary Hunter just asked. It's a great question that are the electors required to cast the vote according to the population? That is a question which has been debated probably since the beginning of the Republic. Very recently, the Supreme Court did come up with a decision. I think it was as late as last year, which essentially said that whatever the state rules are, the electors have to follow that, which means, let's say, the rules in this state and most others, actually in almost all of the others, is that if the electors representing one of the candidates win a plurality of the votes from the population of that state, those 6 or 55 or however many votes are there, they go to that candidate. So yes, the population in each state makes a decision. However, in a very technical sense, if the legislature of Kansas decided, and I know this is an extreme thing, but if they decided that, starting in 2022, the 6 electors of Kansas, no matter what, are going to vote for Bryony's dog to become president. Are they allowed to do that? Most likely, yeah. They'll probably make a case that Bryony's dog may not be of that age of 35 and more. But you get the point. It is so technically, state legislatures can decide, but right now, the popular vote in each state pretty much guarantees those electors going to a particular candidate.
Michaela, I would like to just kind of chime in there as well. When you ask about kind of how we divide this out and how many electors each state gets, I think the other thing that this does is it kind of highlights the importance of the census when we do our census count, every 10 years, because what they're going to do, after everyone, it's important that everybody fills out their census when it comes out and sends it back, because then that goes back to the Census Bureau, and that may change the number of representatives that a state might have based on population growth or if the population has shrunk in those states. And so a state like Kansas, if Kansas grows enough and people fill out their census forms, we may be able to pick up another seat in the House of Representatives, as well as another elector. And so we've been at 535 for a while with our 435 representatives and our 100 senators, but all of that is subject to change as census goes through and, as these census numbers are figured out for each state. So it does highlight again the importance of participating in the census, which is mandated by the Constitution as well every 10 years.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm happy to report I got an email yesterday from the state librarian who's on the committee to do the census in Kansas. And Kansas is slightly over 97% recorded in the census at this point. They're still reaching out to others. If you're a college student who was here on campus in April, would have been here had we not shut down the campus in April, you are to report your location as being in Kansas. So some of our college students who were from neighboring states and so forth should be counted in Kansas, which is something that not everyone knows. We have a couple other questions. I'm wondering, Bryony, do you see the one from Corey Tubner on the margin of error on a poll aggregator like 538?
I do, yes. First, I would like to say that if my dog were elected, the U.S. would return to the top spot on the cutest heads of state list. Sorry, Justin Trudeau. The question is, what's the margin of error on a poll aggregator like 538? And also, did Nate Silver account for the education factor that stunted the surveys in 2016? It's really hard to calculate that because 538 uses a number of polls that each have their own individual margin of error, and that's very much affected by the sample size in the poll. So it's hard to calculate a total. And what 538 does, if you look at some of their other pages, I just sent the one, but there's some other pages where they show a whole range of possible outcomes. So the data, again, is a little more reliable the more you get, the more you put together. But again, it's really hard to factor a total margin of error for that because you're using polls from so many sources. The education level factor, that was kind of something that was realized in hindsight. So that was not something that was accounted for in those polls in 2016. That was something that was kind of discovered going back and kind of digging through the ashes of some of those less than reliable polls to find out where some errors might have occurred. So hopefully those different polling organizations have kind of corrected for that error, which will improve the reliability of individual polls, which again, those together will improve the reliability of aggregators like 538.
Thank you. We have a link from Isam, who is suggesting there's another way of looking at how they're improving that part of polling. So I encourage you to look at that. And a question about, can we view this later? I certainly want to remind myself of what was said. Butler will be posting it on their YouTube channel as soon as the recording is done. So we'll have that information for you. And we'll probably send out some of the links separately in a follow-up email if that's useful for people. It is a good learning opportunity. And I had another question, but I've sort of forgotten what it was, but I think it's sort of on the line of, so how much should we trust the polls? And what about those people who get told, well, you may as well not go vote today because the East Coast has decided that they're going to elect a certain candidate, how it influences on election night? What do either of you know what's going to be happening this year on that subject?
Yeah, I can take the second part that Bernie had handled earlier, the more important part of it about the reliability. It is, there are times we are told that for one reason or another that your ballot probably doesn't matter. I'll point this out that unfortunately a part of it is somewhat true in that what we call battleground states where there is competition. Those 10 or 11 states, they're much more competitive than the others for whom we pretty much know. I mean, barring a huge cataclysmic event of some kind, chances are that we know how Texas or Kansas or California is going to cast its electorals. So there's some part of it is true, but also let's keep in mind that in addition to presidential elections, a whole lot of other elections take place at the same time. There in many states, there's legislatures which are on the ballot, they're mayors, they're commissioners, they're members of Congress and the Senate. So yes, casting a ballot is an important thing, even if the state that you're in is non-competitive in terms of presidential elections. Brian, I'll let you answer the one about the reliability and how polls close at different places at different times.
Yeah, it's, again, the polls were not unreliable in the total votes cast in 2016. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So I would say get out and vote for all the reasons that Isam stated. There's other things to vote for, local elections. Those are very important. Get out and vote. Another factor that may kind of change things a little bit or even delay completely accurate results in some of those battleground states this year is the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a huge push towards mail-in and absentee ballots. Those are not always counted by election day. So it's entirely possible that some of these battleground states might not be 100% decided on election night. So that's another something to keep in mind. We may have people, since that system is being heavily promoted, there are places like here at Butler campus where we're registering people to vote absentee or by mail. I know the city of Wichita is setting up ballot boxes for some elections. So there's different measures being taken. Perhaps people that maybe couldn't vote before are able to vote for the first time this year. Maybe we're looking at some different populations. So anything goes. I mean, like Isam said, there are some states which will pretty reliably go one way or the other, but we're looking at some potentially sizable shifts this year just in the population of people who vote. So again, get out and vote. It's the American thing to do. It's something that we shall be proud to do. And me personally, if you tell me you didn't vote, I'm not going to listen to any of your complaints for another 4 years.
I would also like to, I agree, Bryony, the importance of voting, it can't be overstated, right? So, and to your question, Michaela, if we listen to the news and the news says, well, you know, the East Coast has decided for candidate A, and we just kind of throw up our hands and say, well, then we're just not going to go vote because it doesn't matter. I think the last election, well, most of our elections in recent history are proof that each state's vote does matter, because what it shows is that the electors, which is how the president gets elected through the Electoral College, those Electoral College votes make a difference. It generally comes down to a handful of swing states, but even those swing states wouldn't matter if Kansas's 6 votes didn't make it to the Electoral College. And when we have the majority of our major population centers residing on the coasts and then in a couple of key areas throughout the Midwest, if the state of, if everything has voted East Coast moving forward and it looks one direction, and then you have the states that, like Wyoming maybe, that just decides to not go vote, then it's gonna throw off the numbers. And so it's important that everybody votes, everybody exercises their rights. And as someone who's participated in local elections, it is also important to go and really pick your local electors. We do live in a federalist country, so states have a lot of power. So electing your local state representatives, and electing your U.S. representatives and senators from your state, electing your board of trustees, your city officials, your county officials, those are all very important, because to Bryony's point, when we go vote, that gives us an opportunity to have a voice in the direction of our communities and our states and our government. And I would agree with Bryony that without voting, it's kind of hard to complain, right? I didn't take my opportunity to help affect change, so why should I be out complaining about it? But we live in a free country where we complain about whatever we want, so.
And remember, we do in Kansas have a tight Senate race this year. Even sometimes those local elections actually directly influence our lives even more than the presidential election does. There's a very tight race in the Senate between Roger Marshall and Barbara Bollier. That has the potential to influence our life in Kansas. Also county, city commissions, things of that nature. So definitely go out and vote.
I'll add in there that, Aaron and I, we work on the same building large part of the day. So the local elections are so important. I mean, humor aside, if there is a major issue here, I can actually go up to Bill and say, well, what are you doing in this city? Something that, probably I can't walk into the White House and say, what are you doing, man? It doesn't work that way. So, I mean, local and state officials are much closer to our real lives and policy matters than people in Washington are. One other thing, Michaela and everybody, I'll share with you, that there are oftentimes we hear these news stories or articles that, well, let's abolish the Electoral College. And I mean, people may be one way or the other about it. As the mayor said, it's a free country, but let's keep in mind that the Electoral College is set in the Constitution. And statistically speaking, as Bryony knows very well, that changing the Constitution is close to impossible. In the 233 years of the Constitution, I believe somebody calculated about 11,000 amendments have been proposed, of which about 17, of which 22 have made it. So you can do the math. It's close to impossible to do that. And some other changes be made outside through state legislation, possibly. Two changes which Maine and Nebraska have come to mind. Maine and Nebraska are two states, the only two states which do not award their electors to a winning candidate entirely. They divide it up by something, Michaela, you mentioned earlier. It's closer to that model. they divide up their electors based on congressional district. So on election night, it's very possible you will see in both Nebraska and Maine, they will say, Nebraska has this many electoral votes, of which some of them went to one candidate and some went to the other candidate, based on which candidate won one of their congressional districts. On the other side of it, we also see for the longest time, right up to the 1930s, I believe, the state of South Carolina, they didn't use popular vote for getting their electors elected. What they did, the legislature got together and would decide who to award their votes to. So that's the other extreme of it. But again, it is, as the Constitution says in plain words, it's left up to the legislatures of each of the states to determine how their members of the Electoral College go and cast their ballots for president.
But that, you know, the challenge there, Esam, is that if you have a state, you know, in the Midwest or the western half of the country, let's say, that has made a decision to assign all of its electoral votes to whatever the national popular vote is, which we know has happened in a few states, then that revisits Michaela's question from earlier, right? So if watching the trend from the East Coast, where a significant number of our population centers are, if we're able to see at that point that candidate A is going to win the popular vote, no matter what, that's just how the popular vote's going to go, then the challenge that you have is you may have people stay home in states that have elected to just send their electoral votes to whatever the popular vote is. So it takes away the opportunity for that state to really voice, to have a voice in the election. So, you know, that's one concern I would have in that process. But that's, I guess Corey Tubner just kind of asked that question or kind of typed that in there, but that's a challenge that a concern that I would have in that, right? So a state like maybe a Colorado or something, that if they've opted to assign all of their electors to whatever the national popular vote winner is, then why would people in Colorado vote? Because that's not where the biggest population centers are. You just wait and see what New York and Houston and, you know, Los Angeles and Chicago and Dallas, the major population centers, wait and see what they do, and then just stay home and let your electors be assigned. And that really doesn't seem like a very democratic way to operate within each state, in my opinion.
I wonder if I can make a brief comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Randy has a comment that he'd like to make.
Well, I'm enjoying the discussion, and it's kind of somewhat in response to Esam's comment. I wanted to get to the point of why we have outcomes in the Electoral College that are skewed from the popular vote. And the main reason we have this is that, as Esam pointed out, 48 states do a winner take all on the Electoral College vote. So even in, you know, if the vote is 50.1% to 49.9%, all of the electors go to that candidate, and it essentially cancels the popular vote of those people in the 49%. And so we've reached it. I mean, this has happened, I guess 3 times now, but it's also happened twice in the 21st century. So the reason I think there's a perception of crisis about the Electoral College is that we seem to be stuck in a mode where this could happen almost every election, and it could swing from one side to the other. But Esam's point is very important. That it's very difficult to change the Constitution because it requires a 2/3 majority of both houses and 3/4 approval of the state legislatures. So that's a very high bar to cross. So states can change how they send their electoral votes, and they can do it proportionately by the congressional districts, as he pointed out in Nebraska and Maine. But I'll just end by saying, when we have such an extreme partisan divide as we do in the country, as we have for the entire 21st century, the last 20 years, it really hasn't changed that much. And that you have states locked in where the winner, we know who the winner take all is going to be, which party in most states. So we have, it's kind of ossified, it's frozen. And we don't have that much movement of population right now, actually. We'll see how the census turns out. But what it means, and then ultimately the advantage goes to rural states in the Electoral College, because the smaller states, and Kansas is among them, has 6 electors, but 2/3 of this Kansas electors are the Senate. Let's go to just a couple. Wyoming has 3 electors, but 2 of them represent the Senate seats, and that's true in Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota as well. So that's really, in a sense, tripling the impact of the electoral vote in the smallest population states. So anyway, enough said by me, but I'll just say we're in a real conundrum with the Electoral College, because it looks like it will consistently skew the election away from the popular vote in the current climate. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Appreciate your comments. And I wonder if our panelists have a response to anything that Randy said kind of struck you.
I do, and I think, and I appreciate that, Randy, and I think this goes back to kind of what we've talked about throughout the presentation today, and that's the importance of the vote, not just now at the federal level, but also at your state and local levels, because as difficult as it is to change the U.S. Constitution, it's not as difficult for a state to change, to change their representation at their state level, in their state house and their state senate. And those state house and those state senate are the ones that can affect that change in how your electors are distributed. So each of those each of Maine and Nebraska, their state has decided as a state, this is how we want to distribute our electors. All the other 48 states have decided another way, and that's decided at the state level. So again, get to the polls, vote, elect representatives that will best align with what you want individually, what you want your electors to be able to do. And those are the people that can go to the state house and affect that change there.
Now, Michaela, something that Corey mentioned, I'm going to tag on to what the mayor said. It is true that it may appear from the rest of the world that having a president who doesn't have the support of a majority of the citizens is probably not as democratic. That may be true. But keep in mind that when the framers got together in Philadelphia 233 years ago, one of the things we talked about as we started this was the concept of balance. And they really wanted to balance both the fact that people should have a say in who governs them, but also that there should be, in some cases, there should be a modifying structure between what people want and how governance works, so that there is what they wanted to refer to as, in those days, I guess, mob rule. They wanted to keep that away from a new republic. So the balance that they created was the House of Representatives directly elected by the people, the Senate not quiet, even though now it is, and the president, they kept certain other obstacles in the way so that it's more of a representative democracy as opposed to a full-fledged democracy. It's a balancing act. Now, certainly there are multiple views on that, whether it is good for us, whether it is democratic or not, but the counterpoint is this, that it was by design that the election of the president was supposed to be a little more than simply popular majority. It was also supposed to be a majority of the states. And at the end of the day, the United States is a union both of the people and of the states, and that balance has to be kept in mind.
And keeping in mind that as the Constitution defines us as a representative republic, rather than a majority, democracy. There's a difference there, and it again continues. It provides an opportunity for smaller states to maintain some power, at the federal level.
I would also add that the results of the Electoral College are not always reflective of everything about a state. If you look at a state like Kansas, yes, the Electoral College, we've gone Republican the last several elections. We currently have a Democratic representative in the House right now. And our governor's seat has pretty reliably flipped back and forth between Republican and Democrat over the last several elections. So it's entirely possible, again, that we could look at flipping. It's not set in stone. It's not a reason to not go out and vote. I wanted to address a question that was posed about polling. Vicki asked, are there polls in which ask, would you vote for a dog? And 80% say yes. And then ask, would your neighbor vote for a dog? And 40% say yes. Do these really tell us anything? The short answer is no, because you're looking at two levels of opinion predicting. So the first is a poll asking you for your own behavior. That's the polling administrator looking to be able to predict people's behavior. The second is asking respondents to predict someone else's behavior. And I can again use a Super Bowl analogy for this. If someone asked me, am I cheering for the Chiefs? I would have said no. They would have asked, how many of your neighbors are cheering for the Chiefs? And I think, well, when I was in the grocery store last week, I actually ran into two people with 49ers hats on. So my perception maybe of the balance of fans rooting for each team might have been a little bit skewed by that, by the people I ran into or the people I've been around. And I think that a lot of times our perception of what's going on and our perception of what others feel is a little bit skewed by the people that, we surround ourselves by. We tend to be friends with people that are more like us. And right now, I think a lot of people are trying very hard to maybe eliminate politics from their friendships. Other people have, seen friendships, family relationships kind of decline because of differences in politics. But it makes, just thinking about our own circle kind of makes it a little more difficult to predict behavior as a whole. So no, when you're looking at two levels of opinion polling, behavior prediction, it makes it fairly unreliable, I would say.
That I'll add Professor McCain's comment question, even though it was in humor, it's a great observation that as to what sometimes local elections can do. Believe it or not, and I think some of you know it, there are communities, there are little towns and villages, and I know of some in Alaska. There's one that I know in Nebraska where officially they elected a dog as their mayor. Or a cat as their mayor in some Alaska town. So yes, what does that say? Sometimes a lot of people do like dogs and even cats more than humans. Okay.
I live in one of the bluest parts of Wichita, so I see more signs for Biden and Bollier than I do for other candidates, but that's not necessarily reflective of the city as a whole.
You'd be interested, I hope, to know that there's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and he did a study about that perception part of this polling question to understand what people do. And Friedman wrote that what they have found is that what you see is all there is an intuitive understanding that all of us have. So we have to think slow and long to realize, oh, there's other viewpoints in the world. And it's just one of those really interesting studies about the human brain and how we think that pertains to this kind of question of polling.
So I had a question, Bryony. The people have asked me in the past, sometimes you get people to say, we hear all these polls on the news and on the end, we see them on the internet and so forth. Why am I never called to be polled? Or people, that is what people ask. Or people may say, can I volunteer to be polled? Are there ways to try and get more involved in the polling process?
That's actually a really good question. The most reliable polls are taken from voter records. It is people, not necessarily registrations, but people who have voted. I know I saw a link yesterday, someone posted a website where you can look up and see how your friends have voted. I know that sounds a little invasive, but actually that is public record, not necessarily the votes cast, but whether or not they have gone and exercised their right to vote. So voting is one of the big ways to be involved in that. Go and vote, not just the general election, go vote in the primaries, go vote in the midterms, go and vote, because then you will get your name on the list of reliable voters. And again, that kind of eliminates some of that bias. If you're someone who has voted in every one of the last elections, you are more reliable as someone whose opinion will carry through to the ballot box. So that would be my first and my main recommendation if you do want to be part of that. Another is just answer those random number calls. I think a lot of us miss out on that opportunity because we don't. I know I've been getting a lot more of them over the past few months than I normally do. It's normally just, you know, someone pretending to be the IRS or wanting to sell me a car warranty. But pick up those calls. Hey, you can have all sorts of fun with some of the scammers. Those are a little less reliable. You know, the ones that appear on a website that tends to be a little more partisan. It's a bit of an echo chamber, and you could always have, you know, we talk about those people that are sitting in their mom's basement bored, clicking, you know, yes 100 times just to have some fun with it. So there's a little less reliable. But to answer your question, the best way to be included in some of those reliable polls is go vote every single time and pick up those random number calls.
Perfect. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to pick up on something from what Brian said earlier and the mayor mentioned. There is sometimes there is a misperception that, you know, the larger the sample size that we need, as we want to get more reliability, we need a greater and greater sample size. To a certain extent, that is true. But mathematically, and in a little bit, I can post the link there. After a certain level, it really doesn't matter. So, for example, in Kansas, and I don't have the exact numbers, once you're getting about 600 or 700 people in a randomized and stratified sample, the difference between 600 people and 6,000 wouldn't make that much of a difference in the reliability. I know this is somewhat counterintuitive. I mean, we tend to think that bigger sample, better reliability, but mathematically after a certain level, it doesn't matter for most states.
I think we all see this, like if we're watching the election results on TV, you know, once the results start to come in, especially for those bigger elections, they don't usually change very much from those first few precincts of reporting. Now, sometimes we see that in the smaller local elections.
Right.
For example, like I said, my neighborhood tends to be pretty blue. So when we're looking at city or county commission, those can start to skew when, you know, my precinct, their results are in. But for those bigger races, those statewide, those nationwide races, once we start to see those first few precincts come in, it doesn't usually change all that much.
Well, and I think and pre-election, we see so many polls because polls, like you said earlier, are really just a snapshot of the way a person is thinking or feeling at that very moment that they're asked the question, at that very time. Things can change, you know, and so that's why we see the fluctuation in the polls leading up. But I would agree with you completely, having watched elections, you know, my entire adult life and how this works. You're right. Once, kind of generally speaking, once the precincts kind of start reporting, that's where you end up.
Well, and I know a few years ago, there was a move on the national media level to embargo the results of the polling that happened as people voting were coming out of the voting booth until a certain number of hours had gone by. So people in California weren't seeing, for example, what was happening in New York for a time period. I hope my memory is correct. Brian, do you remember this too?
Correct. I do somewhat because I was part of that consortium as a field worker back when I was much younger and had a lot more hair. It was it was a voter news service, ENS, which had 5 or 6 news organizations which had made a consortium. I believe, and Brian, you may have more info, that I believe at some point after the 96 election, that consortium kind of dissolved. There were some copyright issues, some issues with who was going to pay more, who was going to pay less, and then they went their separate ways. The agreement kind of resolved itself.
96 was a little early for me. But yeah, there have definitely been some moves to that. And remember that a lot of what you're looking at on election night is not necessarily reporting of results, but like Michaela said, it's exit polling. And again, our election, our voters could look very, very different this year. We could have people a lot voting by mail that don't necessarily vote, and we may have people that normally vote that don't. So just keep that in mind. Just know what you're looking at. Realize that election night, mostly what you're looking at is exit polling. Things that are close could go, a different way when some of those absentee and mail ballots are counted. It's going to be interesting this year. It really is. I think we'll learn a lot with this push to go more toward mail ballots.
That is a very good reminder. I am one of those people working from home, and I've already put in my absentee ballot request. And a reminder to everyone who's still listening that the librarians have this information. If you want a little help guiding you through a website or anything, we're open for you, and we have that prepared for you and available for you. Are there any other questions from anyone?
I had one for Esam. As you mentioned earlier, Esam, there's been a handful of times in American history where the president didn't win the popular vote, but did win the electoral vote. Bush, Gore, and then of course Trump, Clinton, just a couple years ago. So when this happens, do you think that the choices for the president accurately represent the will of the people, and or accurately represent the will of the states? And this is kind of a commentary on how the Electoral College itself, since that's really what we're talking about today. When the president wins the Electoral College but not the popular vote, does it better represent the will of the states as opposed to the will of the individual person?
Promise we are not going to ask hard questions.
I changed my
there
mind.
Goes a politician's promise, man. That's an incredible question. It's a philosophical one, I understand. And as a former political science professor, this is how I would respond. That it is neither the will of the people nor the will of the states as much as it is the will of the republic, especially of a federal republic that we are. And in our system, for national offices, and really, we elect only 2 national officers, the president and the vice president. They're elected to serve, they're elected to reflect the people and the states, the actual union, which is the United States and the United States of the people. So in that sense, I think they do represent, that election represents an election which reflects the will of the federal republic that this is. And that's not always, I know ideally we would want to have a reflection of the will of both the people and the states. But just because the popular vote does not tally up, does not in any way take away, in my opinion, the legitimacy of the president, at least under our constitutional system.
Right. Thank you.
Well, I'll take a moment to thank our panelists. We have a little more time left if you pop in with another question, but I really do want to thank each of them. Esam, particularly for approaching the library about this in the first place, and gathering Bryony, who did a wonderful job, and Bill, thank you. And I love your background, Bill, the We the People, thank you. That was really appropriate. A scholarly interaction, conversation, a forum. It's really important for our students and for ourselves. And I hope that we've provided a chance for you today to consider these questions. And I think we've understood that it's not exactly a nightmare, but it comes close for the pollsters. And there's certainly a variety of solutions that they have devised to continue to offer polling to the American people and to the politicians who really look at polls either from their own ability to poll or the more general ones. So we're very grateful to hear from you all about this. And thank you, Mayor Young, for being part of this and giving us that local perspective too. Really appreciate that. At this point, I think I'm going to call the forum to conclusion, but I wonder if each of you would have one final word for us in today's program. Starting with Bryony.
Go vote, just do it. No excuses, go vote.
Thank you. How about you, Bill?
You know, I started the conversation today with the preamble of the Constitution, and it says, "We the people, in order to form a more perfect union." And I talked to Isam a little bit earlier about this. You know, voting, continuing to be involved in the process, that's how we continue to evolve as a country and kind of strive for that perfection. We've never been perfect, but the only thing that we can do as a country, what we know is we've been given the blueprint by the Constitution to continue moving that direction, and being involved in the political process through voting and through these types of conversations is really what empowers our citizenry, empowers us to try to continue that path towards a more perfect union.
Thank you, Bill. Very true. Thank you. And Dr. Muhammad, one last word from you, please.
Kayla, first of all, thank you to you and your team for putting this together, especially in these pandemic times. It is all the more important. So thank you so much for working with us. Many years ago, long before even any of us were around, after the Constitution was ratified, the great Ben Franklin was asked, "So what did you create for us?" And he said, "A republic," and then had some pause and said, "If you can keep it." And keeping it matters to all of us. And in a lot of ways, how it is kept is what Bill and Bryony said earlier: participate. Because without participation, republics soon devolve into oligarchies and then basically disappear. So that's my message too.
Thank you. Well, with that, we're drawing to a close. And if you have any other further questions, please contact the librarians at the college or any of these speakers through Butler Community College. I'm happy to have hosted and happy to know that this will go on the Butler Zoom YouTube page. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Michaela.
Thank you.